I taught almost that verbatim statement to Avery when she went off to school during spooky season, and someone said, like, what's a ghost? And Avery goes, ghosts are the disembodied spirits of the offspring of giants and humans called the Nephilim. And my little, 2-year-old precocious daughter would, like, rattle that off. That's why I got to rip the Band-Aid off, Nick.
Awesome. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the I'm Telling God About This podcast, where we bring the nonsense to God and God into the nonsense. Haven't used that one in a while.
There we go.
Throwback. All right, today we're going to talk about the season. It's October now, and as you could probably tell, every October, the theaters, when they had money, they were just developing all kinds of horror movies. Like, this was the season. And growing up in a Christian household, it was always perpetuated this idea, or this myth, in my opinion, and actually, in fact, that Halloween is inherently evil. It's satanic worship and all that stuff. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to talk about horror movies in general, maybe touch on it. And some of us don't like them. Some of us absolutely love them. And we're going to see if there's a balance there. Where are the left and right limits of that, to use a military term. But yeah, Josh, Nick, how you guys doing?
Doing good.
Good.
Man.
I'm excited about this conversation because I am anti-Halloween. So I am excited for all the feedback in the room. I'm like, yeah.
Let's play off of that. Tell me why.
I don't worship demons. Thank you very much. And I'm excited for your perspective.
So maybe
I loathe horror movies because I think there is no goodness to be found anywhere in them. And the amount of times that my child wakes me up at 3 a.m. because he's scared of ghosts or dragons or monsters or shadows. The most recent one this week was ghosts, because daycare has been putting up little like ghost statue figurine things. Well, and it's like, thank you guys for contributing to my already lack of sleep.
You just have to tell them, say, look, ghosts are not real. It's probably the disembodied spirits of the Nephilim. So, so be careful.
Funny story about that. I taught almost that verbatim statement to Avery when she went off to school during spooky season. And someone said, like, what's a ghost? And Avery goes, ghosts are the disembodied spirits of the offspring of giants and humans called the Nephilim. And my little, 2-year-old precocious daughter would, like, rattle that off. That's why I got to rip the Band-Aid off, Nick.
Awesome.
What I did was I showed them Lord of the Rings really early, all right? And, like, little cutout, flannel graph, scary ghosts don't hold anything to the Uruk-hai, all right? And so, like, you go through a couple weeks of, them climbing in bed with you, and then after that, you see something scary, and they'll be like, Gollum's freakier.
Look, okay, to be fair, here's the thing. The thing that got me out, and I want to hear your guys' story on this, and I don't know how old you are. Josh, we're the same age, but I don't know how old you are. We're in 1993. But when Jurassic Park came out, like, what's the thing that kids love? Dinosaurs. I didn't sleep for like a month after watching Jurassic Park.
Do you know
literally in my mind, I'm like, raptors running down the hallway, because it was the kids. They were going after kids, man.
Dude, the three that got me as a kid were... And I still, to this day, I don't understand my father and why. Like, the 80s were a dark time. We'll get into why that's part of this. But, like, here's a couple for you, right? The opening scenes in Labyrinth with the Muppets in the walls, like, she's going to say the words, like in the flash of lightning and stuff. I was like, there's things that live in the walls. I didn't know that, and now I'm concerned, right? So that was one of them. The other one was classic Ridley Scott film, Legend, where I got to see, what's his name, who did the clown in It, too. He did every bad guy in the 80s, whose name now is escaping me. But anyway, he did, like, he was this giant devil, like, with huge horns like that. I was like, now I have a face to put to all of my Bible stories that I've heard as a child. Yeah. And then Ultimate was Chucky. And I don't know why that screwed with me so much.
Chucky.
I never even saw Chucky. But once I became aware of the concept of it, that was enough.
What was the one with the gnomes? There was one with gnomes too.
You mean like
it was like a Chucky
Leprechaun?
Concept, but it was
Leprechaun.
Leprechaun. That
with Jennifer
was it.
Aniston.
Leprechaun. Dude, couldn't do that one.
Yeah, I think one of the things about I think there's a couple things here with this topic. One is there anything redeeming in scary stories? And then
no.
The second piece is what is scary stories? What do stories say about society based on what type they are? And to give some credence to maybe even some Nick's perspective, I thought about this too. It's there is something to be said about what you consume and the impact that it has on you, right? Because it does. It's very true, right? But then there's also something about, I made a comment in Josh's other podcast, Cosplay Eternity. Shout out. If you're not a subscriber, go check them out. We did another episode on a similar topic. And one of the things that we looked at in that is, there is something to be said. I made the comment in his show that the last type of movie that I want Hollywood to stop making is scary movies. And the reason for that is this, because in a increasingly secular and increasingly postmodern world, what the free market tells us is that the thing that scares people is the supernatural. The prospect of there being something beyond what they can explain, touch, see, smell, taste, and the majority of the flavor of those movies are based in a Judeo-Christian narrative in this concept of, the age-old ghost story. The idea of the afterlife and the implications of that on both our life now and, the prospect of death is so interesting and or scary to the majority of the population that it's still the subject of major motion pictures and $1 million business deals from completely secular companies. So, there's something to be said about that. And it's
interesting, horror movies, they're easy to film. They don't really require a whole lot of special effects.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to. And yet they're entertaining, they have an effect, they sell out. And but because the subject matter hits home to all of us, death is coming for all of us.
Yep.
And we don't have help.
Yeah, because
that we know of, right?
Yeah, but you don't leave. I get your argument, but there's zero dots connected in the audience to, and now you need a solution. You just go home scared. There's no redeeming component to them. What is it?
The fact that they go home with a hope. Because most
the
people,
afterlife, I can talk to my ancestors. Let's get a Ouija board. All right,
most people think they're good until this time of year rolls around. Summer's happening, life's good. Oh, I've got it all figured out. The sun's shining. I can go out in shorts. I don't even have to think about bringing a jacket or whether or not it's going to rain. And then the leaves start to change. And everybody forgets this because we're so far removed from it now. But the reason that culturally this time of year is focused, becomes spooky season or death becomes the focus, is because historically speaking, this is the time of year where people die. You know what I mean? It's they call it cuffing season.
True?
I better.
Is that true?
Yeah. Think about this, dude.
True?
For majority of
spring is when new life came in.
We'll get there.
I understand.
Before, this is for the listener. I know you get it.
Happened.
But fall is the precursor to the end. Everyone knows winter is coming. And what happens in winter in a world without antibiotics? People die. So you're all right, Jim, hope to see you in the spring. Let's have, one more big party. Let's get everyone together while we're all still here. Cause about a third of us aren't making it till the spring. And then spring shows up and then everyone's why do we have all this focus on fertility and new life? And it's cause we got to replace the part of the population that we lost during the winter. So mortality, memento mori, it's not just something that teenagers get and buy on jewelry on Instagram or something like that. Memento mori was an actual thing that people used to get on jewelry or would write down and stuff to remind them of mortality. And so my what does that have to do with what you're saying, Nick, is that anything that takes people from a sense of I've got it figured out to I wonder what's up there. That's the plow running through the field as far as I'm concerned. And so what I'm stoked about is once a year, Hollywood goes and does my work for me, and they plow the field. And then I get to come through and say, like, hey, worried about the afterlife? You worried about this? You worried about that? Like, yeah. I mean, does that make sense?
Because, like, the reality is... sorry, go ahead.
I don't see... I mean, it makes... Your argument makes sense in my head and in your head. I'm thinking about the secular person's head, right? Like, you watch some movie about the random strangers in the woods that come and kill you at night. Like, there's not a lot of newness in horror. Yeah. It's like the same thing over and over and over again. It's like, okay... So I watched the movie. What was the one? The babysitter one or house sitting one? That was a big popular one.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. The whole trope. It's a whole trope, right?
Sure.
But my point is you don't leave that movie theater going, I need to go see the chaplain tomorrow. Chaplain, there's going to be people that come kill me from the woods at night. Help me. I need faith in Jesus Christ, my Savior. I'm contemplating my death. It's just a worthless place of a movie to then be scared now every time it's dark out and never let somebody come babysit your children.
So you said two great things there that I love. One is there's nothing new in horror, which is interesting, right? You know why is that? Like, why is it we have to go reinvent every other thing? But like horror has like some pretty standard lines for these plots. And do you know why they don't change? Because they work. And they keep working, and they work everywhere. That's why you can go take a scary movie like The Ring or The Grudge that comes from, Japan, and you can remake it in America. It's not as good, by the way, but it still resonates because it all speaks to a deep-seated innate fear. And whether or not people will talk about it or not, you're right, they're not going to show up in my office because they went and saw a scary movie. You're 100% correct about that. But what I'm getting at is the fact that it's still profitable tells you that it's speaking to something deeper in the human condition that exists and that people are connecting with and resonating with, which anything that pulls people out of this, there is no God, nihilistic secular mentality, as far as I'm concerned, is doing more than Fireproof. Like, I'll take The Ring over Fireproof any day of the week. Like,
well, okay, let me also make a nuance here, because what we're not saying is that we endorse the evil, scary aspect for the evil of it. We're not endorsing horror movies for the sake of the message or the sake of
the promotion of
it being the promotion of evil, right? Or of gore. I mean, and there's certain things where I'm like, I like some horror movies. There's others that are just like way too gory that I'm like, it's not scary to the sense of like there's something supernatural. It's just like I'm afraid of a serial killer now, right? But even then, you can still have some. But I'm more of like the horror movies that promote, like, are focusing in on the supernatural because it opens up the conversation, right? So, and this is where I think Christians get it wrong, just like where we've gotten Halloween wrong. Okay, you see. And I think it's even worse with Halloween because Halloween is not, and never in its origins, is not related to the pagan ceremony of Samhain, which is where a lot of people, even in the church, try to tie it and say, well, this was during the Celtic or the Druidic ceremonies where it was the time of year where the veil between the supernatural and the material was very thin, and so then you had these evil spirits coming over, and so therefore in order to go out you had to dress up. That has nothing to do with Halloween. Halloween is All Hallows Eve, right? So you have All Saints Day in November 1st, which was a day in the 6th century or 7th century, is when you had the church celebrate those that have died. Then you have November 2nd, where you pray for those that are in purgatory. And so some people, not endorsed necessarily by the church, go and said, well, we should go and identify or acknowledge that those that are not saints that have died, and those who are not in purgatory, but those that are in hell, right? And so it became this thing where that was the day before All Saints Day. Let's recognize the mortality and this is a good point, Josh. If you die without a savior.
Heresy leads to heresy. That's really the moral of the story, okay? Like, that's what we're getting at. And that's what I was saying earlier, Josh, with what Josh is pointing out is like, oftentimes there is a false equivalency between the fact that like cultures all over the world celebrate the winter and summer solstice. And it's because of what I talked about a minute ago. Like the reason that the winter solstice is focused on like death and mortality is because of what comes before it and then, or what comes after it. And the reason the spring solstice generally becomes a time of celebration across multiple cultures of fertility and new birth, and even in our Christian context, of the reason we celebrate the resurrection during that time is because creation is reflecting a narrative that is part of our story. And so it's a appropriate time to synchronize explicit, special revelation and general revelation. And we're not the only ones who see that, right? I mean, if you think that, Jesus was actually born on, December 25th, it's not really the case. Or that he was born or resurrected on Easter Sunday, which moves around. Like, no, it's not why, right? But we pick those days for that reason. So this false equivalency gets propagated all over the internet. Like, oh, well, they celebrated this time, so that must be where the Christians took it from. No, they had their own holiday during that time, and they called it this, and this is where it's originated from. But yeah, so I agree with what you're saying,
curious,
Josh.
I'm curious, Nick, like, can you explain what and we could go around and like totally do popcorn style here, because I think we all have stories growing up in the church and growing up as Christians and with parents that were God-fearing people. What was it like for October for you growing up? What were the things that were the, I don't know, the perceptions of Halloween in general?
Yeah, I mean, I was raised Presbyterian, good old Frozen Chosen, shout out. And for the most part, we had no dealings in and around Halloween. It doesn't mean I did not do trick-or-treating in the good old days of the early 90s when it was, proper to go around and hang out with thousands of your neighbors knocking on doors, and there was no danger afoot.
Wait, so you did do trick-or-treating? That was okay?
I did do trick-or-treating. It was okay.
Yeah,
but that was because we lived in a cul-de-sac. We lived in a cul-de-sac where like that was what everybody did. So it was more of like a kids event. And there was like one house that had spooky stuff, which we always walked past and never went up to. And then everything else was like us going to ask our neighbors for candy. And then we didn't do anything else other than that. Definitely not a focus on any other component. Maybe we carved a pumpkin. But
did your church do anything?
No, I don't think so. It might have been like a trunk or treat at most. Something festival? Like that. Harvest festivals, stuff like that. Yeah, and then like I was the family, like we weren't allowed to watch Harry Potter. So it's like there was a bit of the like traditional Christianity upbringing, but like we never watched horror movies, we never watched scary things, we never participated in any of the quote unquote dark side of Halloween. Yeah.
I wonder what's that reason
why?
Because it's all trash and worhless, and you shouldn't go near it, and it wastes your life. And I don't worship demons.
Right. I don't like the. You said something I'm interested in. I think we're on the same page on the like. I don't know what other parts of Halloween people are celebrating. Maybe that's a piece of it. Like when I think about it, even when I was growing up, like we did like the church thing. My parents were super, conservative Baptists, and then we moved to China when I was 10, so I pretty much didn't get to experience Halloween. It was only real demon possession straight on out for me. It's like no fake demon possession for you.
Only the
real thing. Like you want something to be scared of, I'll show you what you could be scared of.
Oh my gosh.
Maybe that's why I don't have as big of a problem with it, because like I'm just walking around watching these nerds cosplay, and I'm like, you wouldn't do so well with the real thing,
Totally.
But because I think that's what I see is like you're so off base when I look around at most of the stuff that you don't like. It's just foolishness as far. But to them, I think people who, whatever we talk about, like the dark side, like we never decorated with like, skulls and bats and like dark stuff like that.
Glorifying
witches.
No gore. No like like in my family we do like cartoon characters, like the kids can dress up as like.
That's
the dark side.
Point,
What
right?
is the dark side of Halloween? Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah.
Nick?
100%.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Like that's I mean, a good example, and I'm not going to try and get too much on my soapbox here, but I'm happy
By all
to
means.
do so.
Go for
it. Our church does a trunk or treat. We're known for it. The whole block, the whole community knows us for it. We took the kids 2 years ago, and it's the local children and local individuals that come dressed up as the scariest, darkest, craziest
on
thing.
Purpose.
And like my kids were like losing sleep for like a straight week, and I was like,
True.
We will literally never do this again.
Yep.
And so for me, when I say we don't celebrate Halloween, or I'm not about this holiday or whatever the heck you want to call it, I am about getting dressed up in our local community and doing a bonfire in the backyard and having spiced cider and like
fall stuff.
That sounds like, I don't know, that sounds like a druidic ritual, my friend.
All having a bonfire. But the second,
Dressing
but
up,
the problem
having a bonfire.
go ahead,
I don't know.
Nick, go ahead.
It's actually
Sorry,
quite on brand with our podcast, which is the problem is that the world, the secular world, has taken hold of it.
Bingo.
And there's
Boom.
nothing good.
Bingo.
There's nothing good to be found in those components of it, and so I will not expose my children to those components of it because that's what's involved. And so the most exposure they have is outside of my control, and it's at daycare. And thankfully, I have addressed this. They're borderline, there might be a scarecrow or a scary pumpkin or some spider webs and some spiders. And that's the most of it, and a few like ghost innuendos.
Sure.
But they're not waking you up in the middle of the night scared of what they saw at daycare, though, right?
My point is the ghost one was enough to do it. So like I go into daycare the other day, and they're watching The Nightmare Before Christmas, because my daycare insists on using television screens to placate the children and watch them.
Yeah.
And I was never allowed to watch that as a child. But it's like, okay, my 3-year-old has now seen a movie I've never seen.
It's so funny you say that, Nick, because I wasn't allowed to watch it either. And I remember, like, usually I'm the one trying to get away with watching things that my wife is putting the kibosh on. And then one year, the kids were like, "Can we see The Night Before Christmas?" And I was like, "Absolutely." And I was like, "Yeah." And I was like, "What?" Like, I thought this was some evil movie.
You're okay with this? Yeah.
So then I watch it, and I'm like, okay, like there's some like spooky, but it's good. It's not gross or over the top.
No.
Totally.
And the songs are catchy and whatnot. And it's actually became the motto of our last PCS because we moved during Christmas. And so I actually bought Danelle a Pandora charm that had Jack and Sally on it, and it's The Nightmare Before Christmas to commemorate the insane move across the world over Christmas. But I still, when I think of that
Christmas,
movie,
that's great.
I think about a movie that like was not appropriate as a child. Like that was a textbook example of like that's what those people do.
That's right. That's true. I don't expose my children to horror movies, nor will I until I don't really feel like there's a need to,
Well,
but I'm saying like
go ahead, Josh.
it's like I don't like. This is not to say that we should be okay with horror movies or Halloween celebrations with what the secular world has made it, and bring our children into that. What I'm saying is that like this is something ultimately when they're older, they're going to be exposed to it whether we want to or not, and I'd rather them actually be prepared. And so leading up to say, hey, did you know that this originally was a Christian holiday, or this was something that's been usurped by secularism? This is what heresy breeding heresy comes from, and then also teaching them about the victory of Jesus and the conquering of sin and death, and so there's an evangelistic aspect to this, and that's I think the main point,
and a discipleship.
I support it.
Here's something that I found, right? So here's where I want to make a distinction too, because not all horror movies are this way. So I just want to we kind of mentioned that a minute ago. I'm not talking about slasher movies like Jason or Freddy Krueger or anything like that, right? I'm talking about
gore for the sake of gore.
I'm talking about movies with a plot that is anchored in the supernatural elements of life. Like I remember the first rated R movie, like scary movie that I went and saw, and I remember I called my mom and I was like, "Hey, can I see this?" I think I was a freshman in high school. And I wanted to go see End of Days with Arnold Schwarzenegger, right? And so I called my mom and I was like, hey, can I, like, we were going to go see this movie. Can I go see it? And she was like, you have to make that decision, because whatever you, just remember, like, whatever you put in your head, like, you have to deal with afterwards. And I thought that was a wise way of saying it. And I did go see the movie, but here's what it came out of it. And here's where I have seen the value, and where, as my children get older, and I've seen this even with soldiers, is that in a certain stage of life, before we're all jaded, to your point, Nick, people aren't coming in saying like, oh, I'm scared. But when people are being exposed to these kinds of ideas initially, there's a tremendous opportunity to provide real context. You know, like I can't wait to watch certain movies, with scary movies. I have some particular ones in mind with my kids when they're teenagers, because of the conversation that I'm going to have during and after that movie. That me saying, like, there's a difference between dad spouting off about, you know, the nature of the supernatural and exposing your child to something that is like, because there are movies that capture certain elements of spiritual warfare, I think, fairly accurately, like, to some extent, right? Or the nature of oppression, or the nature of mental illness, or the nature of what it feels like to, you know, be experiencing like, that's what art does. It captures an emotional experience. And there are certain thrillers and horror movies that really capture the very term gaslighting, for goodness sakes, comes from a thriller, right? Where a guy goes in and turns the gas lamp down on his wife. And she's like, isn't it getting darker in here?
Crazy.
And he's like, no, the lamp's the same all the time, right? But so I think there is a redemptive quality to certain material, but you have to think as a parent, and I think even as an individual, if the juice is worth the squeeze. And I think there's a level of maturity, right, spiritual maturity and normal maturity, where with context, you can appreciate something without it having a detrimental impact to your psyche or your soul. But that's a really, you know, difficult thing to navigate, I think, for most people. What do you think about that?
I'm going to take the other side of this argument.
All right, by all means.
I completely disagree.
Okay.
And I cannot find any, in the plethora of the multifaceted nature of the world that we live in and the amount of media that we have to consume, and or other content, and or other great books, I cannot find an ounce of redemptive quality within any horror movie that I have ever watched that doesn't mean you're wrong. You are correct in the words that you chose to use around, I can use this as a teaching moment, I can use this as an instruction moment. However, I have 1,000 other things that are better than the 8 horror movies, right? Like, if I want to teach my child about the supernatural or ghosts, right? Like, my nightmares as a child were from Frank Peretti books, because I was convinced there were demons and angels and the spiritual warfare.
What's the difference?
That's not... Oh, it's hugely different. That's not...
No, Frank Peretti just gives you the context in the book. The difference is
I'm
giving you the context as dad.
No.
Finish your thought, Nick. I got something after this.
I read all those books too.
Okay, there is no component of horror in any of those books.
What?
There's not.
Demons are real, and they're out to get you.
That's not horror. They're
That's
not out
terrifying.
to get you.
That is literally the basis of horror movies.
Let's talk about rapture anxiety. Okay? There is nothing that scared me more as a child. I told you about Chucky and Labyrinth. You know what scared me as a child? Freaking Tim LaHaye. Tim LaHaye scared me more than anyone else. I would turn around for years of my life whenever all the white people disappeared. I'd be like, is this it, Lord? Am I alone? What did I get wrong?
Because everybody that you're missionary to were pagans.
No, it's fine.
Anyway, Nick, finish your thought.
Go ahead, Nick.
Finish your thought.
Go ahead. All I'm saying is that I personally cannot find any redemptive component for having myself or my children watch a horror movie. That does not mean they can't watch a thriller or a very engaging, like
intense,
Constantine.
emotionally.
I'm not talking about anything theological. I'm simply saying Constantine, in my mind, wouldn't qualify as a horror. I love it. I swear by the movie. I can't wait. They're going to come out with another one, I think.
Also a scary
I'm so
movie.
excited. No. That's my point. I wouldn't call that a scary horror movie at all.
What?
You would? So maybe our
Can we
definitions
cut in,
are off.
Josh? No, right here. No, pause. Right when he says that, you cut in the scene with the demon crawling through the mirror. Right there. Okay? Continue.
Okay,
Oh my
but
gosh! Or
okay,
him
hold
as
on,
a kid
hold on.
seeing people as
Hold on.
demons. Like that's
there is a difference. Listen, there is a difference between. Oh my!
I'm sorry.
I can't. I'll wait.
Oh my gosh. No, go on.
There is
Please.
a difference between there being moments that are scary in a movie and horror movies. World War Z is one of my favorite movies. There are plenty of scenes that are scary. I'm not afraid of my children experiencing things that are scary.
Maybe we need
Okay.
to.
I'm not
Yes.
putting them in front
Yeah, I was gonna
of
say, maybe
a
we need to
horror
define what
movie.
you-
Okay.
Yeah.
Then I'm probably in
Okay.
agreement with you then, Nick. If
Yeah.
Constantine is on the table and World War
Oh, yeah.
Z, then we're probably talking about a
yeah.
lot of the same movies.
Yeah, maybe we're talking
Cool.
about the same
Yeah,
thing.
cool.
We're not again.
Yeah.
I think we made the distinction
When we
of like
say
gore
horror,
for the
like,
sake of gore, thrasher films. That's not what we're talking.
Okay,
about.
I'm not
well,
We're talking
exposing
about
my
the-
children
First of all, Constantine, I don't think would even get classified in a horror movie. Like, there's a
Right.
class in IMDb. Like, we should probably look that up. Like,
The only
my
reason
theory
it
is
doesn't-
the secular definition of horror is that
What's up?
which I do not engage in.
I would say
All right. Well,
this is okay. So semantic argument, but I think the point, what we're actually talking about here, is the same thing. I
for
think that
This is
there's
actually
the
a really helpful.
grotesque. I think
designation.
that grotesque things are not beneficial to society. Like what I would consider the slasher genre of horror. Okay, I don't think has any redeeming quality. All right. What I consider horror movies that do have redemptive quality are movies, or would mostly be classified as thrillers, that have a dark supernatural edge. They have jump scares in them, just like Constantine.
so it's classified as supernatural horror.
There we go.
Or horror. But if we
Okay.
take, for instance, Saw.
Yeah,
or
Saw,
something.
No,
right?
no redemptive.
Right?
There's nothing
Splatter
supernatural
horror.
about it.
Yeah.
well,
it's-
I'm on
yeah, thriller,
IMDb
horror,
right now.
splatter.
Best horror movies of all
Yeah, let's
time.
look at the top 10. Let's
Look,
see what
right
that
here,
looks
top
like.
10.
Here, you share,
Alien.
Nick.
How do
Here,
you
kill
do?
yours.
Alien.
Great
Share my
movie.
screen. Okay, let
Great
me
movie.
share my
No
screen.
redemptive quality at all from what I was talking about earlier, but a fantastic movie. Props to you.
All right,
Ridley
which
Scott.
Alien?
Great
Alien?
storytelling.
Yes, I actually Aliens. I didn't know there was another thing like
yes.
that.
Yeah.
But not done by Ridley Scott. I don't think that one was.
Psycho. Saw.
Nope.
Saw's number 4.
That's okay. I know why though, because it
That's
defined a
probably
new
because of the
genre.
cost of it.
No,
Yeah.
no, it wasn't. It was because of the format. It was a new trope. It was the
Okay.
escape.
Oh,
It was
okay.
the escape room trope that it kind of defined.
Exorcist. The
Classic.
Exorcist. I never
Redemptive.
saw it.
That's supernatural.
You gotta
In fact,
watch
actually,
that.
the
Never saw
writer
it.
of it, the writer of The Exorcist, was wanting to make this a conversation starter
Yep.
about the supernatural. Like, anyway.
The Ring number
Fair
6,
point.
amazing.
The
Perfect.
Ring.
That was a coming of age
I
moment
did see
for
The
me
Ring, but I
and my
don't
brother.
remember much of it.
Well, go rewatch
Texas
that bad
Chainsaw
boy.
Massacre.
Nope, not redeemed, not redeemable.
Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Not
The Evil
redeemable.
Dead.
Hilarious.
The Evil Dead.
Evil Dead is hilarious.
That's a comedy.
Army
That's
of
not
Darkness.
real.
That's right. It's more of a comedy.
Listen,
man.
Wrong Turn should be watched by every
Sam Raimi,
college.
bro.
I will make my girls watch Wrong Turn before they go to college.
That's
Just-
crazy.
Yeah, because I want them to
right.
understand that, like, look, if you don't do what I tell you and follow the instructions on the GPS, you could get eaten by genetic mutants in West Virginia. All right, like,
I can
Rosemary's
teach that-
Baby.
I can
Rosemary's
teach that same lesson in a much better movie.
yeah, but it won't leave the
Yeah.
same impression.
Okay, so let me jump in here. Let me jump in here
I'm
because I
kidding.
wanted to
I'm
respond to
being
a couple things.
facetious.
That
I'm
you were
not
saying.
letting my
I know.
children watch
So-
that.
I know.
Right. So
That's for the
here's
fans.
here's the thing that to respond to what you're saying is that there's 100 other things that are more beneficial to our children to expose them to. Yes, but as we experience growing up in a Christian household, oftentimes we're put in a bubble and then we get released into the world, and then you become like, not every case, but like, look at the Mormons, right? Like they have this bubble, they go into the world, and then they become like everything. Like every crazy story that I heard of like an ex-Mormon had to do with some sort of something. They get released in the world, and there's some weird, crazy sexual experience that they have. Yeah, right? Night of monsters. Anyway, so I'm saying is like, there is a benefit of exposing your children to the world that they live in, but they're not of, in increments, right? And so being able to have those conversations to say, hey, this is what the world is doing. Here is the truth. You need to be able to engage with it. And then the second thing I would say is in regards to like scary, like how Frank Peretti or Constantine and saying, well, those aren't really horrors, or that's not really scary, and that's not, here's what I would say for that, okay? When I was a kid, I could always ask my parents, hey, is Freddy Krueger going to get me when I sleep? And they would say, no, Freddy Krueger isn't real. But then when I would say, hey, I'm afraid because of the sin that I've been hiding, that a demon's going to get me, are demons real? And they would say,
yes.
Nope.
Yes.
So, like, coming from also a charismatic background where we took the supernatural seriously, like, those are the things. What would you rather wake up in a sweat running to your parents' home, afraid of Frankenstein and Freddy Krueger,
or the demon-possessed monk that's been following you around a city all day?
Yeah, exactly. Like, I mean, come on. So, anyway, that's all I would say.
Here's what I like, though. Here's another way I put this, because I think we're in agreement, Nick. I think what we're basically saying is there's a certain type of movie that's just not beneficial, right? I agree with that statement wholeheartedly. I will say that the reason that movies are it's such a profound industry, and why the format has not changed very much since its inception, is because there is a level of impression, of emotional connection that we have with movies that we don't have in any other format. And that is, and especially in the narrative of story. And that's really why I speak specifically about good filmmaking that is anchored in a really good narrative, can often demonstrate that picture. Like I joke about Labyrinth, but I watched Labyrinth with my kids and I was a little worried. They laughed. Like, clearly they're so desensitized that the little Jim Henson puppets don't scare them like they did me. But they got the idea.
CG is.
Dude, I'm telling you right now, go rewatch that. Like, cut that in here. It's like, she's going to say the words, like with a lightning flash. It's scary. It's still to this day. I'm like, I don't really like that. Like, if I found that if I was like crawling around my crawl space and saw that, I'd be like, nope, I'm out. But
I think puppets in general.
Yeah, I generally am just against puppets and like the whole 80s Chuck E. Cheese vibe. I mean, there's a reason why Friday Night at Freddy's or whatever that game that the kids are playing these days is scary. But all that aside, what I'm getting at is that like stories and movies can communicate. And like my kids watching Labyrinth, they got the idea, and it's a great moral story in that, which is like, hey, don't be ungrateful. Think about what you're saying, because what would happen if that actually came true, and what would you really do? So if they get to kind of see that painted out, and it's powerful. And so like, I think there's something to be said about how we teach that. And I'll pivot to a different angle, because I think this is another similar picture. I don't have a problem with my kids seeing violence in a realistic context. For instance, I don't have an issue with like things like, Lord of the Rings, or like things where where physical violence or danger is possible, and death. Like, I have not sheltered my children for the concept that people die. What happened to so-and-so? He's dead. What is, like, I have...
Right.
Because we live in a world...
Well, and that's a concept that was a concept that was very prevalent in previous generations, where death was around the corner for everyone. Right. And it was a part of
life.
So it wasn't something that's taboo. It's only become taboo since we've had, essentially, good
I don't
medical
know that
system.
death is taboo. I think in this conversation. I'm simply saying death in horror movies. Like, I'll let my kids watch Hacksaw Ridge to learn about death before they need
Bingo.
to watch a horror movie.
No, they don't need it for that. I wouldn't use it for that because that's fair. Less realistic. But I agree with you. My point is like war movies and those things. But some people would have an issue with that too. So that's what I'm saying is that like some people would say, oh, well, kids don't need to be exposed to that. They don't need to understand that. And to which I would say, well, you know, kids who grow up in third world countries are exposed to all of these things on a daily basis. They're exposed to demonic possession. They're exposed to the supernatural. They're exposed to injustice, crime, and murder. And it's traumatizing. This is something I think about a lot. It's like, yes, there's levels of exposure that lead to trauma in anyone, right? But there's also a point where like kids can be kids with crazy traumatic things happening all around them, and they're good. If you've traveled in third world countries, a lot of times what I would see, going back to our short-term missions episodes, when I would see, we would bring in short-term missions trips, and I would see these people be exposed to the way that kids live, the conditions, the things that they're seeing, the things they're doing. Or I talk to soldiers and they talk about the things they would see kids being exposed to, and they're like, but they're running around kicking a soccer ball as if this is totally normal. And it's overwhelming and even traumatic to the Western viewer because we're so insulated, we're so isolated from a sterilized culture that it is just the idea of being exposed to that as a child. There's like transference happening. Like they're being traumatized by thinking of themselves at that age being exposed to the things because they or their own children. And it's a very interesting thing to me, like how, you know, how that happens, because I think of a worst case scenario to tie to our last episode, you know, about preparedness. I think that it is very possible that in my children's future the world will not be as stable, and they're not going to be grown ups when that happens. That's what I think about a lot. Is that I have a strong sense that it is highly probable that my children are going to be exposed to a tremendous amount of uncertainty, danger, and frustration in their lifetime before they're potentially fully mature and capable adults. And so I think about, what do I do to prepare my children for that experience? You know?
Controlled danger,
shepherded
evil, right?
Exposure to
being
evil,
exposed to, you know, all these things.
Concepts.
Yeah.
And shepherded is, and to be on par with what Nick's saying, because I agree with you. I think we're on the same page in the sense of like, that is the hard part, is like, how do I expose this, but then also not hurt, you know, like it's inoculation versus, you know, damage.
Well, and I think, and maybe we can, this is another topic and maybe we can land here, but I think one of the important things to mention in all of this is just how much the church, quote unquote, has demonized, pun intended, Halloween, and it given into the culture that has usurped all the things and said, yeah, no, this is something that's satanic and demonic, and just giving it over to the world. And this would not be a thing if the church was more vocal and taught more on the supernatural. Like, do demons and powers and principalities, do they exist? Yes. Why aren't we talking about them?
Right.
When was the last time that there was a pastor that said, all right, guys, turn your Bibles to
Genesis 6.
You know, Genesis 6 or you know, in Daniel 10 or 9 or 7 or whatever, the Prince of Persia, or let's talk about the spirits in prison, or let's talk about, you know, Jesus saying I've called you gods in Psalm 82, and like, let's talk about the weird stuff in the Bible that doesn't necessarily make sense. Yeah, exactly. And so when we're talking about the supernatural, the church don't address it because, one, it's too weird. Two, it doesn't fit our tradition or of our theology or of our doctrine. But here's what I would argue. Okay, there is a podcast that has recently blown up in even the most conservative Christian circles, the Reformed circles, and so on. It's called Haunted Cosmos. It's an excellent podcast.
Great podcast.
And it goes over the supernatural. It goes over a lot of this worldview that there is a heavenly council and that there's powers and principalities, and it kind of takes Christian theology and doctrines into the scary stories of aliens, ghosts, witches, warlocks, all these things, right? And so these are conversations that should be happening, but they just aren't. And I would say that I feel like for me growing up, the only reason I think I was more exposed to it is because I grew up in more charismatic circles where they took this stuff more seriously to some extremes, and to where it was just like, okay, that's a little bit too much. And then there's other areas, but it was like, at least we're being exposed to it. We were having these conversations. We recognize that ultimately as Christians, we have authority. We are God's image bearers on earth, and we are with creation groaning, for restoration.
Josh, I love that. And this is, I think this even ties into, especially with having Nick here because of what he does for work. But yeah, I place this in the same category as sex in the church. Like, we don't talk about it because, why? Because the pastors don't know about it. That's the reality. You know why it doesn't get taught in churches? Because seminaries don't teach pastors how to address these issues. That you get a quick drive-by, and unless you have a
in angelology and demonology, it's like one class.
You get like not even a class, like a lecture.
I'm saying one
like a single
class,
lecture.
One lecture. That's right.
In a 45-minute class over the course of things. If you
without a follow-up
right,
paper, or
no, in-depth dive into the narratives of how this very important
Second Temple Judaism, how they made entire systematics about it.
Or even
with, this was important.
Even with sex and and the male-female union and the appropriate place of it and the beauty of how God created it and intended it. Like, the point is that when we fail as church, as pastors, and as men and women, as Christians, as disciple makers, when we fail to study the Word as it touches all aspects of life, when we leave a void, where does that get filled? Like, before I went to seminary, that's where I learned about, that was part of my curiosity with scary movies, is I'm always wondering what the next Hollywood intern who's been tasked with finding some niche scary thing to anchor the next, haunting plot in. And then I go and I research the backstory and I'm like, oh, that's interesting. That's a true story. Oh, what's that about? And where does that come from? And but because you're searching for literally stuff that is there. And this gets back to what we were saying earlier. The reason these stories land year after year, decade after decade, 100 years after 100 years, is because they're anchored in something that is real and true. And spoiler alert, is in the Bible. So instead of letting kids go hunt down this stuff on their own and be exposed to god awful things in the process,
and bad teaching,
maybe, just maybe, there should be some mature individuals, i.e. parents, then also pastors and people discipling, who are willing to say, you know what, I feel very underdeveloped in this, and I should probably spend some time learning about what the Bible says about these things so that I can do my job and make disciples. Right? All right, I'm off my soapbox.
You're right. You're absolutely right.
If you're still in your fundamentalist belief, still think that Dungeons and Dragons is Satan worship, then you're
wrong.
You're about 20 years behind, guys. Just saying.
Play Warhammer.
No, I mean, how refreshing would it be if every Halloween or every around this time season the church did because churches love to pick a series. And,
this would be great.
And line things up with the calendar year, and it's this is like rinse and repeat, easy stuff. I just gave you 2 sermons out of the few you need to schedule, and it's I think that would be very fulfilling and enriching for your congregation that's for the most part used to just mother's milk anyway. So it's here, you're going to experience this, your kids are going to experience this, let's talk about it. I think it's great.
I agree. And listen, don't be scared. This is for pastors. I know what really scares you, right? Don't be scared. All right, they're going to be upset. You're going to get an email. Someone's going to come up to you and they're going to say, I don't think that's appropriate, Pastor. Don't be scared. Don't be scared, right?
But just
leave the
just
scary
know
stuff
that
for the
generation.
movies. Do your job.
The generation is dying out.
Right?
Invest in your future.
Just do your job. Anyway, on that note, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching or listening if you're here. Hey, listen, another reminder, if you're watching us on YouTube, listen, you don't have to listen to ads. Look, we're not popular enough to have people want to advertise with us yet. So, like, look, YouTube's just making money. You could go over to Spotify or Apple Podcasts and you could listen ad-free for the whole hour. Can you believe that? I know, it's crazy. Then one day, maybe we'll have ads there. But until then, you got here early. You reap the benefits, folks. Like and subscribe. Check us out on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen to podcasts. We have a link down in the description. And until next time, enjoy the show.